Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom. And in today's video, I want to talk about St. Thomas Aquinas, but specifically, I'm going to be using as my guide this book by Josef Pieper, a German philosopher, called Guide to Thomas Aquinas. It's published by Ignatius Press, once again by Josef Pieper, Guide to Thomas Aquinas. Strongly recommend this book. It's an excellent book. Um, and what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be reading various quotes that I've underlined and then kind of commenting on them and making our way through many of these quotes to hopefully give you guys a picture of who Thomas Aquinas was, as well as his historical context, the shape of his thoughts, the reasons for the choices he made, the way he taught and wrote, and the movements that he interacted with, all this kind of stuff. Who was Thomas Aquinas? What was his context? Why is he important? All those kinds of subjects is what we're going to be looking at today. So once again, this is Josef Pieper, Guide to Thomas Aquinas. Excellent introduction to who he was, his historical context, the choices he made, the movements that shaped him, and with the directions that he took intellectually and as a teacher. So we'll just get right into it and read some of these quotes and then comment on them and make our way through several of these quotes to get a good sense of Thomas and his context. So starting at the opening of the book here in chapter 1, this is on page 3, here's a small paragraph from Pieper that kind of sets the tone. He writes, "There exists the romantic notion that the 13th century was an era of harmonious balance, of stable order, and of the free flowering of Christianity, especially in the realm of thought. That was not so." So just to repeat that last sentence, especially in the realm of thought, this was not so. The Louvain historian Fernand von Steenbergen speaks of the 13th century as a time of, quote, crisis of Christian intelligence, end quote. And Gilson comments, quote, anybody could see that a crisis was brewing, end quote. So that really sets the stage for what we're going to be getting into, right? We think we have this romantic view of the Middle Ages as this flowering of Christian life, and of Christian thought. Now, he'll go on to explain that in a certain sense, yes, there is that, especially in the University of Paris. It's kind of the result of a lot of these tensions, but it is in fact a time of crisis that yields the fruitfulness that we see in people like Thomas and Bonaventure. But it was very much so a time of crisis, and we're going to actually look at the historical facts with Pieper and his commentary. So the next quote I have is on the next page, page 4. He says, during this same period, 13th century Christendom was being shaken politically from top to bottom. Internal upheavals of every sort were brewing. Christendom was entering upon the age, quote, in which it would cease to be a theocratic unity, end quote, and would, in fact, never be so again. So then he talks about some political stuff going on between the Pope and the Emperor. In fact, let's go ahead and read on the next page another quote about ancient monasticism and its crisis, and then the rise of the mendicant orders. Here he writes, old monasticism, which was invoked as a spiritual counterforce to all these political problems, right, seems to have become impotent in spite of all heroic efforts to reform it. So he has in parentheses here Cluny and Citeaux, St. Bernard and all those movements. And then he goes ahead and comments on the state of the episcopacy at the time. So here is a historical example he draws from. He writes, an eminent Dominican prior of Louvain, who incidentally may have been a fellow pupil of St. Thomas under Albertus Magnus, St. Albert the Great, in Cologne, wrote the following significant homily. In 1248, it happened at Paris that a cleric was to preach before a synod of bishops, and while he was considering what he should say, the devil appeared to him. And the devil says, right, tell them this alone, the devil said. The princes of infernal darkness offer the princes of the church their greetings. We thank them heartily for leading their charges to us and commend the fact that due to their negligence, almost the entire world is succumbing to darkness, end quote. So a bit dramatic there, right? And then there's a other paragraph here from Pieper right below this where he writes, But of course, it could not be that Christianity should passively succumb to these developments. 13th century Christianity rose in its own defense and in a most energetic fashion. Not only were great cathedrals built in that century, it saw also the founding of the first universities. The universities undertook, among other things, the task of assimilating classical ideas and philosophy, and to a large extent accomplished this task. So, good things and bad things going on. And moving on to page 6, this gets really juicy. This stuff is good. He says here, so after going through a lot of, read the book, buy the book and read the book. It's definitely worth it if you want to get more details. But here he writes, this mere listing of a few events, facts, and elements should make it clear that the era was anything but a harmonious one. There is little reason for wishing for a return to those times, aside from the fact that such wishes are in themselves foolish. Nevertheless, it may be said that in terms of the history of thought, this 13th century, for all its polyphonic character, did attain something like harmony and, quote, classical fullness, end quote. At least this was so for a period of 3 or 4 decades. Gilson speaks of a kind of, quote, serenity. And although that moment in time is, of course, gone and cannot ever again be summoned back, it appears to have left its traces upon the memory of Western Christianity, so that it is recalled as something paradigmatic and exemplary, a kind of ideal spirit of an age which men long to see realized once more, although under changed conditions, and therefore, of course, in some altogether new cast. So there's more positive about the fruit of that crisis, the intellectual fruit of it. Usually fruitful periods in church history when it comes to theology emerge from certain crises, political, ecclesial, historical, cultural, etc. The next page here, Pieper writes, even aside from Thomas's written work, his personal destiny and the events of his life unite virtually all the elements of that highly contradictory century in a kind of existential synthesis. So that's a beautiful phrase. I want people to really hear that phrase. I'm going to read it again because it's so true about Thomas, as we'll start to see, is that in his person, there's a kind of unity, a synthesis reached of all of these conflicts that kind of converge, and he harmonizes and synthesizes them. And that's the mark of a good theologian, obviously, right? I mean, Thomas is the great, but because they know to live this synthesis and to, announce it and to explain it and to teach it and to move it forward in their life, not just in their head, but in their life as well. And we'll see here shortly how Thomas is embroiled in almost every single controversy of the 13th century, which is fascinating. So here he mentions various biographies of Thomas, a whole bunch of them. He has a nice thing to say about Chesterton's biography. Gilson is much more nice than Pieper is about Chesterton's biography. But skipping through here, okay, so we spoke about Thomas kind of synthesizing in his life various aspects of that century. Let's go ahead and list some of them. So here Pieper writes that the life of St. Thomas contains almost all the components of the century. First, there was the struggle between emperor and pope, which shook Christendom to its foundations and was to force it into a new shape. Second, there was the taking leave of the feudally constituted Benedictine abbey with its early medieval character, which was no longer representative of the age now dawning and could not operate effectually in that age. Right, so the mendicant orders come out of this, Dominic and Francis. Third, there was not only the negative step of withdrawing from the solitude of old monasticism, but the entrance into a city, the entrance also into a university, the first state university of the Western world, founded only a short while after by Frederick II. So here I think he's talking about the one in Naples, but ultimately the one in Paris becomes the kind of paradigm of the university. So you have this move into the city outside, moving out of monastic solitude into the city of the mendicant orders who are rising and all this kind of stuff. So fourth here, so that was first, second, third, fourth, there was the confrontation with Aristotle, which was unavoidable precisely at this consciously secular university, and which could not have taken place in so intensive a form at any other university. Fifth, there was the encounter with the tremendously dynamic, voluntary poverty movement with the first generation of the mendicant orders, an encounter which, again, was possible and to be expected only in a city. Later, we shall discuss each of these points in detail, but especially the last three: university, Aristotle, mendicant order movement. So, all of these confluent and contradictory, in a certain sense, movements are creating a massive crisis, a transition in Christendom at the time. So, let's talk a little bit more about Thomas himself. Of course, we all know that he was taught by Albert the Great, St. Albert, Albertus Magnus. So here we have a quote from Pieper. In 1245, the very year of Thomas's arrival in Paris, Albertus Magnus had begun teaching there. Had all Europe been canvassed, no more important and more up-to-date teacher for Thomas could have been found. So again, he's in the limelight here. He's at the center of the action. And here's another thing that Pieper writes. He says that during those very years in Cologne, Albertus Magnus, so it wasn't Naples, it's Cologne. But anyway, during those very years in Cologne, Albertus Magnus had plunged into the study of Dionysius Areopagite, or here he writes it in the Greek, Areopagita, the Neoplatonic mystic, who, by masquerading as the disciple of Paul, mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, preserved the Platonic heritage for a Christian West fascinated by Aristotle. So that's important aspect here that will become very relevant when we get into, I don't know if we can this time around, but when we get into the actual thought of Thomas, the influence of Plato and Neoplatonism in Thomas through Dionysius and other sources is going to be super important for understanding participation, the role of creation in Thomas's schema and all that kind of stuff, his existentialism, blah, blah, blah. Okay, Pieper writes, Thomas was drastically affected by these bickerings. And here he's talking about the bickerings between the mendicant orders and the university. Let me go ahead and read a little bit prior here to give some context. Pieper writes, at the age of 27, Thomas was recalled to Paris. He was employed there first at the Dominican Academy in the monastery of Saint-Jacques. Later, he became professor of theology at the university. In spite of considerable opposition directed not so much against himself as an individual as against the ever-mounting influence of the mendicant orders at the university, Thomas was drastically affected by these bickerings. The Pope himself had to intervene to cause the university to lift the boycott against Thomas. Under papal pressure, the ban was finally lifted on the same day for Thomas and for Bonaventure. The Pope's letter mentions both by name. It is astonishing to note that in St. Thomas's first works, written during this period, the smooth flow of not a single sentence appears to have been ruffled by all these troubles. Readers of these opuscula, such as De Ente et Essentia, will find it hard to believe that they were not written in the undisturbed peace of a monastic cell. That kind of gives you a glimpse into the inner peace and purity of Thomas, and as the world is in turmoil around him. And so this too, it was a new element which Thomas embodied. Again, remember the existential synthesis of his life, right? Thomas embodied this. Cloistral seclusion became inner seclusion for Thomas, right? Times were changing, and from now on, it would be necessary to construct a cell for contemplation within the self to be carried about through the hurly-burly of the vita activa of teaching and of intellectual disputation. So in Thomas, we see this kind of marriage between the contemplativa and the activa, right? The contemplative and active life, which again is very much what the Dominicans are about. So moving forward. Okay, so let's talk about some of the intellectual controversies. So here, Pieper writes that the real issue was the confrontation with two fundamental philosophical and theological views. So we're talking about the context in which Thomas finds himself before talking about Thomas's response. So the real issue was the confrontation with two fundamental philosophical and theological views. This had a direct bearing on the position taken by St. Thomas himself, the position which concerned him deeply and which he had single-handedly been trying to formulate, clarify, and defend. So what was at stake was the special character of Occidentality, right, of the West. It was threatened simultaneously by those who were anxious to hold fast to traditional Christian concepts, and also by those who perverted Thomas's bold new concept by exaggeration. So some people wanted to hold fast to the Augustinian framework and tradition, which I don't want to get too much into this, but it's not um, how to put this. There's a difference. I'm not pitting Augustine against Aquinas here in his use of Aristotle, but there were some who were basically reacting against Aristotle to core, right, completely, and clinging on to the kind of Augustinian status quo, and others who were taking Aristotle and running with him in a way that actually did violence to the tradition. And Thomas tries to inhabit a place in between these two things, and he ends up alone, right? The comparisons are inevitable, so I'm going to make them, but think of kind of like the rejection of some of the insights during the between the wars and after World War II in theology, kind of wanting to go back to a kind of Suarezsian manualist tradition, for example, not trying to badmouth all of that stuff, but versus the kind of progressive, there's a new thing going on and we kind of scrap the tradition, right? So progressives and traditionalists, for lack of better term. Thomas here, in face of the Augustinians and the kind of Aristotelians, tries to inhabit a synthetic existential middle ground here that synthesizes these two movements by understanding a deeper fundamental unity that moves forward while being faithful to the past, right? So here's what Pieper says. Oddly enough, he says, Thomas stood completely alone in this situation. A most astonishing fact comes to light. This man, who was a teacher by birth, by inclination, and by grace, had no disciple of real importance. Even immediately after his death, there was no one who could have preserved and defended the master's heritage with a persuasiveness even remotely equal to his own. Thomas stood alone, and he threw himself into his task with fantastic vehemence. What he wrote during those last years in Paris, once more, only 3 years, seems almost beyond belief. Commentaries on virtually all the works of Aristotle, a commentary on the Book of Job, on the Gospel of John, on the Epistles of Paul, the great Questiones Disputate on evil, on the virtues, the comprehensive second part of the Summa Theologica. At the same time, Thomas by no means absented himself from the great debate which was raging. On the contrary, all his works were actual contributions to it, even if we disregard the distinctly polemical writings. The debate grew even ever more heated, and in 1272, the superiors of the order suddenly recalled Thomas from Paris. We may suppose that they hoped thereby to temper the intellectual struggle. At any rate, Thomas's successor to the chair inclined more toward the traditional conservative views. So they got someone a bit more conservative than Thomas to teach. Okay, moving forward here. Again, I'm reading a lot of quotes, but I'm trying to paint a picture by some of the passages that stick out to me as I was reading the book. What I'm trying to do is kind of extract from this really fantastic book, which I encourage everybody to buy and to read. Totally worth your time. If I end up teaching about St. Thomas, I'm going to be using this book. But what I'm trying to do is I'm kind of extracting various parts of the book and presenting with my own thoughts a kind of synthesis of these aspects and trying to convey what I'm trying to tell the audience here about St. Thomas and his context, which I think is just so fascinating. And again, looking at history can help us today and help us navigate waters today. It doesn't give us all the answers, but we have to, know about history, be faithful to tradition, and creative, and live it out in our life. Right? Okay, that was a tangent. So here, Pieper writes, Thomas seems to have been the first person canonized for being a theologian and teacher. For 42, the 42 witnesses at the canonization trial had little to report concerning extraordinary acts of penance, sensational deeds, and mortifications. In fact, they seem to have been somewhat put out by this aspect of the problem. They could only repeat unanimously again and again, Thomas had been a pure person, humble, simple, peace-loving, given to contemplation, moderate, a lover of poverty. And he himself had said repeatedly that perfection of life consists far more in inner rightness than in outer acts of asceticism. So, a very simple life of holiness, nothing flashy at all, right? But his purity is definitely a theme that emerges that we'll cover in the future here. Of course, he's called the angelic doctor for various reasons, and that being one of them. Um, he talks about the relationship between the virtue of purity and the exercise of philosophizing, theologizing, thought, right? The relationship between those two. Here, Pieper writes, the enthroning of any system of thought is bound to have some undesirable results. Thus, it is only too easy for those with highly special doctrinal axes to grind to help their cause by appealing to the officially acknowledged canon, Thomas Aquinas. The same thing happens within the particular realm which has set up Karl Marx as its doctor communis. Everyone attempts to validate his own opinion by a quotation from Marx, whether or not there is any objective justification for his use of the quotation. So here he's talking about appealing. So I should have prefaced this section here of the book, page 18 and 19, where he's kind of moving to the present from the past, saying that Thomas is the doctor communis. He's a massively important character in the teaching of the church and the theologizing of the church and the education of seminarians and of just theology students in general. But we have to make sure that we think through things to see whether they're true or not, as opposed to appealing to authority, right? Merely because Thomas is the doctor communis, simply citing him as an authority is not enough to end a conversation. You have to actually be theologically minded and engage in the questiones disputate, right? You have to let the truth speak, right? And so he kind of says this. Some people do this with Marx. Marxists, right? They'll make an argument and they'll appeal to Marx. See, so it's true. Talking to other Marxists, that's just not how things work. And so here Pieper adds, I should like to forestall any misunderstanding of what I am saying here. I do not regard the special, unusual distinction conferred upon Thomas Aquinas by ecclesiastical authority as a mere chance product of certain conservative and unyielding tendencies. Nor do I consider it primarily a disciplinary measure intended to establish or preserve intellectual unity, quote unquote. The Viennese theologian Albert Mitterer, for example, states that Thomism is prescribed by the church. I think such phraseology extremely unfortunate and misleading as well, as if the church's decision were a kind of police ordinance issued solely for reasons of expediency and susceptible to abrogation or alteration. Rather, I am convinced that the preeminent position assigned to St. Thomas, which may now and then strike people as strange, is meaningful and necessary in terms of the subject matter itself, inherently so. Naturally, this is not to call for the sterile parroting of Thomist doctrine. The Thomas encyclical of Pius XI expressly warns against any such thing, or to press for the artificial keeping alive of those elements in Thomas which were conditioned by his times. So he's qualifying everything he's saying. This is an introduction to St. Thomas. So Thomas is extremely relevant, extremely important. However, Thomas is not the same thing as a kind of ideological imposition of my version of Thomism. As you all know, there's many versions of Thomism, right? So appealing to authority is not good enough, but the importance of Thomas is massive, and there's reasons, and he gets into them. And let's continue. So what else we got here? Okay. Let's get into the juicy stuff. Let's talk about why Thomas is so important. So Pieper here writes, in his works, he succeeded in stating the whole of truth in a unique, exemplary fashion. This very fact, however, leads to some less than commendable tendencies. For example, it strengthens the temptation to deal with Thomas in a purely derivative fashion. It favors the tendency to palm off certain theses upon Thomas in order to give them the cachet of his authority. The dreariness of Thomas' interpretation may be traced to this. So he's explaining where that comes from. But the question stands, Pieper says, what, in short, is the greatness of Thomas that has made him the doctor communis of Christendom? Here he gives a example, he talks about Mozart, right? And you guys know that I love Mozart's music. And here's a good example. He says, one cannot say about Mozart, quote, here is an entirely new vein of musical art of which nobody ever dreamt before Mozart. Anybody almost can make a beginning. Let me reread that. Anybody almost can make a beginning. The difficulty is to make an end, to do what cannot be bettered. It is always like that. Prac Man, sorry, I'm misreading this. He's quoting someone else, that's why. Praxiteles, Raphael, and company have great men for their pioneers and only fools for their followers. So that's what, in other words, what he's saying here is like Mozart, Thomas represents a culmination, a synthesis, right? A brilliant synthesis, a pinnacle, a result, right? And so think of Albert, right? Before Thomas, think of the controversies before Thomas. I took a class on this a while ago, a couple of years ago, and I can't remember all the names, but there was all these disputes about the Eucharist, about the world of forms, versus hylomorphism. Abelard was one of them. There was Abelard and all these other medieval names that I forgot. But in other words, kind of Thomas jumps at the end of this and responds to all of it, synthesizes and adds and course corrects certain elements, and he's like a conductor, right? But he creates something from the parts that he received that is both unique and not, right? But beautiful and powerful. And what comes after him falls short compared to what he does, right? So this is what it's like with great minds in history, like Mozart, for example, right? They have a history that's important. They don't kind of come in like Deus ex machina, in an artificial way. They have a soil from which they blossom, they grow out of, right, and synthesize, do something beautiful, right? And then after that, there's a little bit of a downward spiral, but that's important to contextualize Thomas. Here is what Pieper finally says in answer to this question: what's so special about Thomas? Here's what he says: his greatness, and incidentally his timeliness, consists precisely in the fact that a real ism cannot properly be attached to him, that therefore Thomism cannot really exist. Not at any rate, if we understand the term to mean a specific doctrinal tendency conditioned by polemical theses and demarcations, a system of tenets handed down from teacher to pupil, as is the case with any school. This cannot exist because the magnificent statement residing in the work of St. Thomas is far too rich. Its special virtue lies in its not seeking to be anything special. Thomas refused to be selective. He undertook the enormous task of choosing everything. He seeks to be faithful to the deeper intention of St. Augustine as well as that of Aristotle, the deeper aim of human reason as well as of divine faith. This is such an important point that I wish I could convey more and better and more effectively, right? Which is that what makes Thomas so exceptional is that in this conflict, in this 13th century conflict of the worldliness of Aristotle and the kind of otherworldliness of Augustine and the political turmoil of the emperor faced against the requirements of the pope, and the old monasticism dying, and the rise of the mendicant orders, and the move from the solitude to the city, and the mendicant orders as not tied to the normal ecclesiastical governance system, right, of parish priest, bishop, local bishop, and pope, but as something universal, apostolic, under the pope, and yet in all dioceses. And so we have financial problems that start to pop up because they're asking for money. And then there's the preaching, which becomes competitive, and Pieper gets into all of this, right? The point is, Thomas is propelled into this mess, right? And he becomes this synthesizer. He takes everything in and creates a symphony, a synthesis, a course correction on various aspects to bring about harmony. There's nothing original, and yet it's supremely original, precisely in how he synthesizes, right? And so that's why, in a certain sense, so I'm not denying the existence of various Thomisms, right? And Pieper wouldn't either, but here he's being technical and specific in a specific kind of way, saying, in this sense, an Thomism is not possible because, in a certain sense, it's choosing a particular school over and against other developments here and there, you might say. Uh, so, in this qualified sense, he's making a point here, right? Thomas precisely is someone who, in the world he lives in, looks at everything. I think Matthias Scheeben is a great example. Scheeben is a great example of someone who does this beautifully. Scheeben takes from the Franciscans, from Augustine, from Aquinas, from various, Thomists of that came before him, the Carmelite spiritual tradition, all this kind of stuff, right? He's taking from all this stuff and synthesizing and writing his dogmatics, right? And that is very Thomistic, if we want to use that term, right? And so that's important. Now, of course, there's all the controversies with Henry de Lubac, and I mean, if anyone's actually read de Lubac for a sustained amount of time, and a lot of his works, I've been reading a lot of de Lubac over the last several years, and de Lubac does exactly this, right? He looks around and he prunes and he accepts and he rejects and he changes and he brings in, but all he's a conduit, a window, nothing original, but all of the tradition as a synthesis back to the sources throughout the history of the church, not just one of them in the far past, as he would argue against this kind of archaeologism. Sorry, that was another tangent, but food for thought. Let's continue with Pieper. I really love Pieper. Pieper is such, when it comes to St. Thomas, I love Pieper's approach because he writes not just about Thomas. I mean, he has, all this stuff on Plato. He's, putting Thomas in conversation with Heidegger, with Sartre, and with Marx, and it's just so fruitful. What Pieper does, it's really good. So here's a quote from Pieper. Thomas, so he's going to quote the French Dominican Geiger, but Thomas ought to have made choices, but did not do so. And Geiger says, "Or il n'a pas choisi." He did not choose, right? Thomas was neither Platonist nor Aristotelian. He was both. And that would be fascinating to get into. And we will. Maybe not this video, but we will. Okay. So there was this, let's talk more about some of these movements, right? The Bible movement is the way Pieper calls it, but really he explains that this is the voluntary poverty movement, so Dominic and Francis. But in a certain sense, it's a response to the Waldensians. I don't know how you say their name. I have it here somewhere, I think. Anyway, but the Waldensians, and then the Cathars, and this becomes the Manichaean, no, not the Manichaean, sorry, the Albigensians, all this stuff, right? There's turmoil, right, going on, and how do people respond to this? So let's talk about this this evangelical movement, this voluntary poverty movement. Here, Pieper writes, the evangelical aspect was the most telling characteristic of that movement. He says here, Pieper says, it was, moreover, an anti-movement directed against the solid secularity of a Christianity that was making itself at home in the world economically and politically. Now, let me just point something out here about this quote here from Pieper. Economically, I'm glad he said that because there's a whole conversation to be had about the influence of money on the church in the High Middle Ages and how that actually influenced the way we understood the sacraments in relationship to the church and the church in relationship to the sacraments, and therefore ecclesiology and its sources, you might say, namely the relationship between the Eucharist and the church. Now, I mean, too much to bring up in this video, which is just an introduction on Thomas, but that's worth talking about. There was a real worldliness there that Thomas had to respond to through the voluntary poverty movement of the mendicant orders. So here's more on this. So Pieper writes that the Cathars, as they called themselves, from Kataroi, the pure, right? The medieval Cathars were the heirs of ancient Manichaeanism, a tendency which is probably a recurrent one in human thoughts. The Manichees held matter and all material things to be evil, including the body, marriage, the state, visible religious institutions, and the sacraments. The Cathars laid utmost stress upon asceticism, some even carrying this to the point of fasting themselves to death. In view of the secularization of Christianity and of the hierarchy, this movement seemed to have a good deal of right on its side. It attracted to itself a tremendous amount of misguided fervor, and the conditions of the period constantly supplied fuel to the flames. So this is another part of the turmoil of that time period. Now here comes the Waldensians, right? The Waldensian movement, Pieper tells us, was at first entirely orthodox, but was forced into heresy by the failure of the official church to meet its challenge. The name stems from a merchant of Lyon called Peter Waldo, who in the famine year of 1176 gave away his property and tried to live literally by the commandments of Christ, that is, by the gospel. He gathered around him a fellowship of like-minded persons whose distinguishing marks were poverty, Bible reading, and itinerant preaching. These two currents mingled in a number of ways, especially in southern France, where they culminated in a massive popular movement, which is usually called the Albigensian movement, after the city of Albi. All missionary efforts of the church failed. So here he gets into a whole bunch of stuff. I'm just going to read one quote out of it and then continue. Here's what Pieper says. The Pope's legates descended upon the rebellious heretics. They came as judges rather than missionaries. They excommunicated, interdicted, and condemned. But that was not the worst of it. They also stripped themselves from the start of any moral advantage by appearing clothed in immoderate worldly pomp. So, very corrupt and hypocritical group of papal legates coming to just start excommunicated left and right, people who have been radicalized because of the worldliness of the medieval church. This is something that we don't really see enough talked about, I don't think. So I'm looking at the chat here. Yeah, I do sometimes, Daniel. Says I do read the chat sometimes. Okay, so let's continue. So here steps in Dominic. So here we're before Thomas, right? We're kind of setting the stage a bit more. So Dominic and another bishop called Bishop Diego remained in France and established the first community of the order. A year after the Disputation of Montreal, Bishop Diego died, and Dominic became the sole spirit behind the dynamic movement that had so suddenly come into being. So, of course, the Dominican order, right? It was a movement that altogether imitated the practices of the Albigensians. Dominic's reform movement arose out of Waldensianism. To Dominic, it was clear that Waldensianism could be conquered only if its valid demands were acknowledged and carried out within the Catholic Church. Like the Waldensians, he went back to the primitive church. So, of course, that's qualified. He's not an archaeologist, but there was a return to Scripture in order to revitalize the appropriation of the tradition in a very secular, worldly Middle Ages, right? And secular here in in terms of worldliness, right? Of this worldliness, this kind of forgetfulness of the eschatological destiny of man. Now, what's so applicable to us here is this recognition, despite the tension between other people, of some legitimate criticisms that are clouded by the fact that some groups are sometimes radicalized by the hypocrisy of church hierarchy. I mean, don't tell me that's not relevant to us today, right? That's very relevant to us today, and we need to stop mob thinking with the mob. I mean, I know I'm not saying we should all be Aquinas, obviously not, right? Aquinas is an exception here, right? But we should be able to step back from the mob mentality and think critically and with prayer and contemplation and be open to, yes, dialogue, listening, even to people we disagree with, right? And so, also, we don't need to whitewash the hierarchy of the church. We need to be respectful of offices. Obviously, we all know this. And if you don't know that, you have a problem, right? However, we don't need to whitewash corruption. Okay. We just need to be honest and charitable and listen to people we disagree with, right? Of course, all of that is possible because we assume that there is a truth that we can arrive at through this process of disputatio, right? According to the medieval category, right? Questionis disputatio. So, anyway, so food for thought here in that passage from Pieper, which is really good. Okay, more of Pieper here. While this frenzy raged, the Dominican order arose, although the Lateran Council had just decided that no new orders were to be confirmed. So the Dominican order is a kind of, not really foreseen by the church, and the council itself had said no new orders, and yet the Dominican order arose. And Pieper continues, it was an order which distinguished itself in highly revolutionary fashion from the old orders. I mean, this is a radically new concept. This idea that there is a religious order that is not bound to a particular monastery, but that has an apostolic, i.e., universal, in a certain sense, mission, and therefore under the Pope, who is the universal pastor. This is something radically new. The mendicant order, the rise of the mendicant orders is something that was very revolutionary, very untraditional, right? But it was responding to a need because of the worldliness of the institutional church, precisely, right? So here, Pieper explains this a little bit more. He says its members had no stabilitas loci, right? A stable place. They lived not in isolation, but in the midst of cities. They practiced poverty in the literal sense, the poverty of beggars. Begging had hitherto been forbidden to clerics, by the way. Furthermore, they devoted themselves to Bible study and science. The rules of the order even stipulated that for the sake of study, members could be excused from canonical prayers, a dispensation unthinkable in the Benedictine order, which was one of the main orders at the time. So, more context there, right? Okay. Let's talk. Here's another quote about the Dominican order. So the Dominican order, right? It embodied the same radical tendency which had fired Peter Waldo and its own founder, Dominic. Oh, sorry. I think here he's talking about the Franciscans. My bad. Let me just make sure here. Dominic, Dominicans, Thomas, Enunciation of Truth. No, I think it is the Dominicans. Let me just read what I have underlined here. It embodied the same radical tendency which had fired Peter Waldo and its own founder, Dominic. It is the Dominicans. A radical return to the Bible and a renewed dedication to the ideal of poverty. This last is an element which is also present in the doctrine of St. Thomas, but which is often completely repressed, right? The poverty, evangelical, biblical aspect of Thomas. Not anymore, I would say. There's a lot of, what would they call it? A kind of Thomistic ressourcement that retrieves the biblical dimensions of Thomas's work. People like Matthew Levering, stuff like that. Excuse me. And the boogeyman, we're here. This is I think the most, at least for theologians, people who like to read theology and think about it, this is the most controversial aspect of it all. Let me read this quote and then we'll talk about it. Here's what Pieper says. Yet we would sadly misunderstand what this Aristotelianism, in quotation marks, is all about if we did not see it as permeated and interpenetrated by the apparently alien and even opposed element of a strongly evangelical Christianity. So here, Pieper, let me just explain this quote. Pieper is talking about Thomas's quote-unquote Aristotelianism. And here he even puts in parentheses, in quotation marks, exclamation point, because he doesn't like the term, because the term Aristotelianism was actually something used, and it does describe a strand that is problematic and condemned by the church in the time of the 13th century. So here he talks about Thomas's Aristotelianism, in quotation marks, open parenthesis, in quotation marks, exclamation point, close parenthesis, right? He says, it is, you would misunderstand this quote unquote Aristotelianism. You would misunderstand what it's all about if you did not see it as permeated and interpenetrated by the apparently alien and even opposed element of a strongly evangelical Christianity. So here we're witnessing Thomas's genius, how he synthesizes. It's important, right? Opposites, when not in the synthesis, are radically different than the elements of a synthesis. Just think of, this is not the best analogy, but think of a molecule of water, H2O, right? Hydrogen on its own is flammable. Oxygen on its own is flammable. But in the molecular configuration of water, it's literally what puts out fires, right? So radically different if it's separated from the whole versus a part of a whole, right? So this is St. Thomas's genius, and we'll get into that. Let me look at the chat real quick. Sounds good, James. Sorry, just reading the chat. Okay. Let's talk about this Aristotelianism and its clash with Augustinianism and evangelical poverty, right? So here's a paragraph, a beautiful paragraph, once again, by Josef Pieper. I think it's beautiful. I haven't looked at it yet, but anything he writes is great. Here's what Pieper says: both movements contained within themselves sufficient explosive force to shatter the whole structure of medieval Christianity's intellectual order. So Aristotle, right, and the mendicant orders. Let me reread that sentence, right? This is not a flowering, peaceful time in the church. This is a hotly debated, messy situation that Thomas is in the middle of, right? And with his clarity of mind and his purity of heart, does his genius, his magic, right? Although magic is not the best word here. Okay. Both movements contained within themselves sufficient explosive force to shatter the whole structure of medieval Christianity's intellectual order. Both appeared in extremist form, theologically speaking, in the form of heresies. Think of the Waldensians, which became the Albigensians because of the Manichaean influence of the Cathars, right? That's the radical, heretical side of the mendicant aspect of the evangelical poverty aspect. And then Aristotle, think of Siger of Brabant, think of all the secular Muslim influence, all this kind of stuff. That's the other side. The church condemns Aristotle and tout court, right? And of course, Thomas then picks up Aristotle with his friends, and that's a cool story. Actually, there's so much about that in this book that we got to read. Man, it's already 46 minutes. I'm running out of time. Okay, let's read this. So, both movements contained within themselves sufficient explosive force to shatter the whole structure of medieval Christianity's intellectual order. Both appeared in extremist form, theologically speaking, in the form of heresies. The remarkable thing about St. Thomas, who was exposed to these two intellectual currents while he was still a student at Naples, is that he recognized and accepted the rightness of both approaches, that he identified himself with both, that he affirmed both, although they seemed mutually opposed to one another, and that he attempted to incorporate both in his own spiritual and intellectual life. The paradigmatic, the exemplary quality of St. Thomas is, as we have said, contained precisely in his refusal to choose between the two extremes, between the two extreme possibilities. Instead, he chose both and did so not by merely tacking one onto the other in a mechanical fashion. This is important, but by grasping and demonstrating their inherent compatibility. In fact, by showing the necessity for fusing these apparently contradictory and mutually exclusive approaches to the world. A unity here. And how? Through the disputatio, which is very akin, as we'll see, Pieper tells us, to the Platonic dialogue format, just in a medieval register. So much more about that. So, yeah, anyway. And so, I mean, you see this, for example, and I don't want to get polemical. I'm sick and tired of arguing, but like today we talk about the influence of modernism, the influence of, a kind of manualist, kind of rationalist Thomism, whatever. There's a lot of mischaracterizations, granted, right? On both sides, actually. I mean, I would argue. And like, the thing is, like, in isolation, there's some serious danger here. But are you going to tell me that modernism, even though it's wrong, right, didn't have some important insights that were wrong precisely because they were cut off from the whole truth? In other words, for example, the emphasis on history and the emphasis on subjectivity, right? In modernism were so absolutized because they were isolated, right? That it became relativism, that it became historicism, right? But are you going to tell me that therefore we got to expunge from our theology any kind of theology of history and of the subject and of experience? Like, hello, we have a whole mystical theology. Christianity is distinct from other religions precisely in its historical dimension, right? I mean, no, right? So clearly, modernism is a reaction that itself has a history that happened for a reason. What is that reason, right? Like Dominic, instead of coming down dressed pompously and condemning, let's actually listen and appropriate what's good and get rid of the poison, right? And the poison usually happens because of um, the kind of ghettoization and backing into a corner certain people. And I would say with traditionalists, same thing right now is going on in the church with some of the prelates, not to get into controversy, but some people are being backed into a corner and we're surprised that they bite back. Like, give me a break, right? And then the whole, anyway, so I don't want to get too much into this, right? Um, and I think that one thing that we got to look at is liturgy. Like, I think that there is a lot of gaslighting when it comes to the liturgy. I'm going to do a whole series, reading through. I hope I don't get copyrighted or something, right? Reading through Ratzinger's The Spirit of Liturgy. It is so packed with beautiful theology. I mean, history, ontology, revelation, beauty and anthropology. I mean, soteriology, sacramental theology. It's one of those packed books, very accessible, but always giving more meaning the more you read it. I'm going to do a series on that. Okay, let's go ahead and move forward here. Man, I wanted to cover so much more, but I can't. Too much and too little time. Let's read what Pieper says here. So here, what is he talking about here? This is more historical context, I think. Let's just read what he says. The hearer's counter-arguments must be taken seriously and the elements of truth in them recognized. For aside from the products of feeble-mindedness or intellectual gamesmanship, there are no entirely false opinions. The teacher then must proceed from what is valid in the opinions of the hearer to the fuller and purer truth as he, the teacher, understands it. Here, Pieper is discussing Thomas's teaching method and goes into it much more in this book, which is great. Buy it. Here's the next paragraph by Pieper. That is the nature of teaching as Thomas understood it. In this procedure, therefore, the hearer has an absolute right to speak up, even if he does not actually take the floor. The teacher must give him the floor within the framework of his own lecture. Here, then, is the old Socratic Platonic conception at work. That truth develops only in dialogue, in conversation. This precisely was what Dominic had striven for when, shocked by the violent methods being used against the Albigensians and convinced of the utter futility of a merely authoritative, merely judicial mode of establishing truth, the very opposite of teaching, he replaced interrogation by dialogue between equals in the famous disputation at Montreal, right? So, I mean, I would love to just delve into some of these historical documents. I mean, go full nerd, lock myself in a dungeon and read old manuscripts and uncover this stuff. Anyway, okay, here's another quote from Pieper, last one on this page. Oh, actually, I'm going to skip this part. Not because I don't think it's important. I'll just mention it. Here, Pieper gets into the form that the Inquisition took initially, and its problems, right? Now, here's what he says, right? The Inquisition represents, moreover, a taint and a disgrace that cannot be wiped out by any attempts at historical explanation. Now, he also talks about the mixture of spiritual and temporal power, and Andrew Willard-Jones has a great book on this called Before Church and State, and the connection between Innocent III and Louis IX. Was it Innocent III? I think it was, yeah. And how they had an office that was kind of meant to keep the peace in Christendom. There's a lot of scholarship on this. It's really fascinating. I think there's two extremes, and Pieper is fair, very fair in this book. He shows one extreme, which is to basically say that, this kind of liberal critique, which is religion is this ahistorical actor on the secular field that is responsible for violence, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, we need a secular, when in fact, the very creation of the secular religious divide is an ideological tool that was created during the pre-modern wars, quote unquote, wars of religion. William Cavanaugh has a great book on this called The Myth of Religious Violence, right? However, I think that with Ratzinger here, he'll say this elsewhere, and Pieper and others, we have to admit that there was a worldliness to the church that made certain things possible that must be called out and not whitewashed. It does a disservice to apologetics to constantly whitewash everything, right? This reminds me of, I think it was Ambrose. I love him to death, and I'm super indebted to Ambrose for my research in the church teaching on Mary. But I think Ambrose really whitewashes some of the Old Testament figures in a way that really does a disservice to some of these figures. Now, I think it's because of his Greek background, because the Greek mindset has a hard time dealing with some of the more shocking aspects of the Hebrew mindset. And Ratzinger in his book Truth and Tolerance gets into this. I'm already on a tangent. I realize. I apologize. But Ratzinger gets into a tangent on this that's fascinating in his book Truth and Tolerance, where he talks about the difference between Asiatic mystical religion and uh, uh, Judeo-Christian. He calls it monotheistic revolution type religion, where in the Asiatic mysticism, there's an ascent through asceticism to the divine, a kind of monism, right? That means that those who start these movements, these religious movements, are of course exemplary mystics, right? And then you look at the Old Testament, and what you have is people that are just debaucherous, right? And the reason why is because it's not a religion of ascent at first, but a religion of descent, not of karma, but of grace. And that's why instead of the mystic in the Old Testament, you have the prophet, who is God's word intervening in the mess in order to redeem it through grace and not through human means as an ascent of works apart from God's grace and faith in a covenant God who is other instead of this kind of Eastern monism, right? I mean, that right there, that's a book, right? That's a lecture right there. But anyway, Ambrose whitewashes David, I think, way too much. Okay, that's what I'm trying to say. We cannot whitewash some of these events in our history. But I'm going to skip through this because it's not that relevant. I mean, it is relevant to Thomas. He goes through some of what Thomas says. There's a little bit of a tension in Thomas, and there's one part where we just can't agree with him, and I think everyone agrees on that. But that's just something we'll have to look at some other time. Okay, so Thomas started studying at first in the university at Naples. That's important because in the University of Naples, Thomas had a very broad access to the texts of Aristotle. So, um, so here's one of the reasons why, according to Pieper, quote, a student at the University of Naples could steep himself in the work of Aristotle, was the fact that this purely state university, which was keenly aware of its independence from the church, here read in ecclesiastical hierarchy, right? Flagrantly flouted Rome's official ban against Aristotle. So at the time, there was an official ban against Aristotle. What's fascinating is that even though there was this official ban, Thomas, Bonaventure, Albert, they were all steeped in Aristotle, trying to come to terms with these debates. And then there was the anti-Aristotelian movements of the Augustinian traditional conservative types. And then, of course, the Aristotelians that were deviating from the tradition. And then Thomas and Bonaventure and Albert are trying to be faithful to the truth and trying to discover what's going on and how to manage this crisis, right? Now, Pieper gets into some of this on the ground, like were these bans taken seriously? And the answer seems to be not really, right, by the universities. So, so here's a quote about this conflict between the traditional view and the novel Aristotelian view. He says here, this meant a good deal more than the addition of a few books to the curriculum. Speaking of Aristotle, adding to the Arabs, the translations of the Arabs, right? The Muslim translations. Suddenly, Pieper says, a totally new, rounded, coherent view of the world was pitted against another more or less coherent traditional view. That's the crisis here. It's not just like, oh, here's a nice text from Boethius that we didn't have, right? No, like this is a whole corpus of an entire framework coming in and disrupting everything, right? So this new thing, Pieper says, like a wildly roaring torrent, he's quoting someone there, threatened to sweep away the dams and levees of tradition. Nor is it surprising that some men should have been concerned, afraid that the coherence of tradition might be shattered by the assault of radicals infatuated by the new ideas. It is perfectly understandable that in their concern for the totality of truth, their first act should have been a defensive one. After all, it was too much to expect that any man would emerge with the enormous powers of assimilation needed to establish some kind of quote coexistence between the new doctrines, no matter whether they were 1,000 times true and valid, and the old truth. So new and old, how to synthesize, right? So in other words, this reaction against Aristotle was perfectly understandable, which is why the church banned him, even though it wasn't really listened to in the universities. And yet there was also these people in the universities that were freaking out, and people are saying understandably so. And I mean, I agree. I mean, it makes perfect sense. And you can't expect to have a bunch of Aquinas walking around in the university, right? Okay, so in 1263, Rome issued a reiteration of the prohibition of Aristotle. And I think this is about the time where Thomas comes to Paris for this. Is it the second? No, I think it's the first time. You know what? I don't know, so don't listen to me. Okay. At this same period, Albert was writing his great commentary on Aristotle. Under the eyes of the Pope, quote unquote, Grabman says. Grabman is a historian on Thomas, among other things. Probably this means in defiance of the popes. Pieper says, I confess that I do not fully understand how this state of affairs was possible, either for the popes or for those holy papal-minded monks. It is also baffling that, as Grabman says, the commentaries on Aristotle by Albert and Thomas practically abrogated the church's ruling. Probably such inconsistencies reflect the historical cross currents. On the one hand, the elementary process of assimilating Aristotle was begun and concluded within the span of barely a generation, right, Thomas. On the other hand, the church took understandable and no doubt necessary measures to preserve the continuity of tradition in spite of the new ideas coming to the fore. So messy situation, in other words, right? Okay. Let's talk about Peter of Hibernia very shortly and briefly here and then move on. He was Thomas's teacher in the University of Naples, an Aristotelian. Here's what Pieper says about him. His modernity consisted in his primarily philosophical interests and his de-emphasizing of theology, talking about Peter of Hibernia. I think he was a Irishman. Yeah, he was an Irishman. This means, Pieper says, therefore, that Thomas made his first acquaintance with Aristotelianism not in a moderate, but in an extreme and altogether dangerous form. It becomes all the more astonishing that Thomas nevertheless undertook to assimilate this material apparently so incompatible with the radically biblical and evangelical temper of the voluntary poverty movement, and to demonstrate that the two directions actually belong together. Okay, and that's the end of this chapter. We'll stop there. But that's quite flabbergasting, right? Which is that these things were extremes opposed to each other, and both had problems, very serious ones, in their opposition. And Thomas, by synthesizing them, right, by dancing with the devil, so to speak, right, here's dancing with Aristotle, brings about something deeper underneath, right, in order to move forward. Now, there's dangers, and Thomas navigates them beautifully. Now, in the history of the church, when faced with things like this, dangers are no longer dangers simply because Thomas did it. We got to be very careful, right? And Pieper has a whole other book on this, which is beautiful. It's The Silence of St. Thomas. I think it's either the first or third. I think it's the third chapter. It's a three-parter, where he talks about the timeliness and relevance of Thomas and his ability to assimilate and to criticize and to move forward, but that this is something that is fraught with dangers. But in Thomas himself, and this is what this is all about, there's an immense fruitfulness to respond to, especially modern existentialism like Sartre and Camus and the French Beauvoir and stuff like that. There's and Heidegger in Germany. There's a lot of fruitfulness in Thomas to respond to this, and I think, and this is how we'll end, because we'll talk more about Pieper's book, which is excellent. I think that the person who has done it the best to date, right, who has taken Thomas and responded to especially Heidegger and Hegel the best to date, is Ferdinand Ulrich. I'm reading a book right now about, it's not by him yet because he's very difficult, and I'll get there, but I'm reading a book on him right now by David Schindler. And my goodness, I am so excited. I am so excited. And the stuff is just melting my brains. Like, it's so good. But Ulrich, in a speculative register, brings to bear Thomas's metaphysics in response to Hegel and Heidegger, and he allows this speculative mode to actually be nourished by the controversy itself, right? But it responds to Hegel and Heidegger in such a fantastic way. And of course, he has Nietzsche in mind as well, and to some extent Marx, but Nietzsche more. I mean, it's very exciting how the inner fruitfulness of Thomas just emerges here in the hands of Ulrich in a way that's so exciting. I mean, too much to say. We'll have to do a video on Ulrich, the stuff I'm learning. I'm not even reading him directly yet. I've been reading articles on him by Jenny Martin or is it Rachel Coleman? Sorry, Rachel Coleman. Her articles in New Resource Small, but also this. I'll just show you guys this book right here. It's called A Companion to Ferdinand Ulrich's Homo Abusus. I am devouring this. It's so good. But anyway, that shows you the importance of Thomas Aquinas, the kind of timeliness that doesn't go out of fashion, although we have to be careful not to reduce him to an ism, as Pieper tells us. I love Pieper. Pieper's way of introducing you to Thomas, his application of Thomas, his thorough knowledge of the historical circumstances of Thomas. It's all great stuff. I love Pieper. Strongly recommend Pieper. Pieper is super accessible. So I recommend people read him. If you want to know the name of the book, once again, I'm talking about Josef Pieper, Guide to Thomas Aquinas. Excellent book. And I just read like quotes I underlined from chapter 1 and 2, I think, or maybe 3. But anyway, so that'll do it for today. Thanks for watching, guys. I needed to ramble about what I'm reading and get it out of my system. So if you like this content, consider liking, subscribing, and hitting the notification bell. And I am poor and becoming poorer, so consider supporting me at patreon.com/The Logos Project if you enjoy this stuff. And you can go to my website, www.theecclesiablog.com, if you want to sign up for some classes I teach. In fact, I'm going to tell you that the two ones that are my favorite to teach are the one on ecclesiology and the one on Mariology. If you want to learn about that, sign up. And so without further ado, thank you all for watching, and we'll see you guys next time. God bless.